Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard. Today I've got another episode of utterly pointless comparisons for you. I'll be taking a look at the arcade and Genesis versions of Capcom's scrolling shoot-'em-up classic, Forgotten Worlds. As usual, have a look at the specs of the arcade and Genesis hardware while I tell you just a smidge about the game. Capcom released Forgotten Worlds into the arcades in 1988, and it was the very first game on their much-vaunted new CPS-1 arcade board. As such, Capcom really went all out with this one. They filled the game with sprites, loads of animation, tons of different background tiles, some gigantic bosses, and more. It was a really impressive game for the time it was released. Forgotten Worlds was also the third scrolling shoot-'em-up developed by Capcom that featured a guy flying around the screen that could fire in multiple directions. It followed on the heels of Section Z and Sidearms. The arcade version of Forgotten Worlds allowed for two-player simultaneous play. The game was controlled using a rotating dial that allowed you to select your firing direction from one of many. You would hold down on the dial to fire, and you could tap it a few times to unleash the Mega Crush, which was an attack that pretty much cleared all the scrub enemies off the screen at the expense of some health. Personally, I never really used it. Now, Forgotten Worlds had a giant capacity for a game that was released during that time. It weighed in at a hefty 5.31 megabytes, which in Sega's parlance of the time would have been about 42.5 megabits. Speaking of Sega, they ported Forgotten Worlds to the Genesis themselves, much as they had with Ghouls and Ghosts, and would later do again with Strider. The Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds came on a cartridge with a capacity of 512 kilobytes, which is half of 1 megabyte, which is 4 megabits. So for those of you keeping score at home, that means the Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds occupied roughly 1/10 the space of the arcade original. Because of this, as you'd imagine, there were some pretty noticeable cutbacks, which primarily came in the form of reduced background detail and the complete loss of 2 levels from the arcade original. Now despite this, the Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds is still very impressive for a game that was released around the launch of the system on a relatively low-capacity cartridge. It retained the arcade's 2-player mode, and it also played very much like the original game, and it even managed to adapt the control scheme pretty well. You would hold B to fire, and you could use A and C to rotate in opposite directions. The Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds is also a bit of an oddball, in that it's one of the few games that doesn't work with the much later released 6-button controller unless you switch it into 3-button mode. If you launch Forgotten Worlds with the 6-button controller in 6-button mode, and press the start button on the title screen, it immediately game overs, which is kind of hilarious. Now, as far as recording methodology goes for this video, I kept it real simple. I just played both versions of the game through from start to finish. I didn't use save states or anything like that for this one. I did edit out a few black screens here and there in each version to help sync things up a little better between the two games. Also of note is that I died a whole bunch of times in the arcade game, and I didn't die at all in the Genesis version. Alright, on to the comparison! Alright, kicking things off, the intro is pretty much the same in both versions. Except in the arcade intro, player 1 is on the left and player 2 is on the right, while those are reversed on the Genesis version for some reason. As we go into the game proper, the Genesis cutbacks are readily apparent. We lose the starfield in the background and loads of unique tiles from the arcade version, which are replaced with more generic, easily repeatable ones. Also, the buildings on the Genesis are in much better shape than the mostly destroyed or falling apart buildings from the arcade one. I know which apocalypse I'd rather have survived. You can also see here there are way more enemies on screen in the arcade original, which isn't much of a surprise. Notable enemy differences here are the trash-attracting enemy that launches garbage into the sky has a huge variety of refuse in the arcade version, but only the little spinning mines on the Genesis. Also, the spidery walker robots are very large in the arcade version and very small in the Genesis version. The shop is way more detailed in the arcade original, full of stuff that's absent from the Sega version. It's got a pattern on the back wall, a gun in the background, a counter in front of the girl, a lamp in the upper left, some jeweled ornament in the top middle, and much more detail on the bottom of the main info desk. Oh hey look, here's a whole lot of background stuff missing on Genesis. You may be sensing a theme. On this section with the pipes, the arcade game has more enemies and objects to shoot. Also, the arcade game's gears are fully animated. On Genesis, they, well, aren't. On the plus side, I actually prefer the background colors they used in the Genesis port. I just wish the background itself was more detailed. Alright, first boss. It surrounds itself with a lot of different types of garbage in the arcade, while on Genesis it only uses the spinning mines. The boss has more animation in the arcade and even lights up when you shoot it. Ooh, fancy. Here's the end-level graphic with speech in the arcade and none on the Genesis. Also, the picture is wider on Genesis, which I'll explain in a bit. If you look at the backgrounds as we begin Stage 2, the arcade version once again has a lot more detail, but it also scrolls slightly faster than the Genesis version. And the shop pops up earlier in the arcade version. So if we look at the girl in the shop, she appears wider on Genesis than in the arcade version, just like the end-level picture. That's because the Genesis has a lower horizontal resolution than CPS-1. What that means is that on screens that are the same size, the Genesis version's pixels are a bit wider. Here in the arcade, there's a big wall and it blocks your movement. You have to go over it. Meanwhile, on the Genesis, we just get sort of a post that you can fly behind. Likewise, the second wall is missing on the Genesis. We just have a bit of a post at the top of the screen this time. The Leviathan, or snake-like creatures that pop up out of the water, are wider in the arcade original, and there are more of them. The arcade game also puts a lot more enemies on screen in this area. The monster skeleton here is facing the opposite direction on Genesis. Here on Genesis we have one lonely monster skeleton instead of two facing each other. Aren't they adorable? Alright, the dragon. Man, does this look different on Genesis. The arcade dragon is a huge, insanely well-animated, complete monster. On Genesis, it only has a moving segmented neck and is missing most of the body, including the tail, which actually attacks you in the arcade. Here's my favorite level in both versions. It suffers the usual detail and color loss we've seen up to this point on the Genesis. Let's talk about the music. The music in the Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds is really close to the arcade original, and Sega did a fantastic job with it. I think most of the songs in this game sound better on Genesis, despite its slightly inferior sound chip because of the instruments they used. The spider walkers are still small, and the garbage robots still only collect and throw mines on Genesis. The foreground detail takes a bit of a hit here on Genesis as well. Now, one clever thing Sega did here was for the shots in the arcade version for the first 2 levels of weaponry, you can see that it's a line basically, so they had to redraw that from every possible rotation angle. On the Sega version, they made the first 2 levels of shots circles, so it looked the same from every angle, which you only had to draw 1 time. Alright, as we fly diagonally up in this section, we have basically no background at all on Genesis. The arcade version of this part is also faster, longer, and harder. Wait, that doesn't sound good. Oh well. Here we make our final approach to the boss, blah blah blah, less detail, blah blah blah. Whoa, they really scaled back the statue on Genesis. It's more implied than actually shown, as it is in the arcade original. And look at that! The boss is missing about half his body on Genesis. You can't shoot out his individual abs or nearly as many of his armor parts on Genesis. It's a little-known fact that in the arcade Forgotten Worlds, this boss takes approximately 6 months to explode.
If the war god really died, no doubt about it. The king of gods must be saying his prayers now.
Next up, we have one of my least favorite levels in both versions. It's a boring Egyptian-themed stage where you at least get to choose your path at 2 different parts, giving this level several unique routes. I took the upper path in both versions, even though the actual stage components vary a bit between the 2 games. This level sees some of the deepest graphical cuts yet. Pretty much all the detail is removed from the Genesis backgrounds and replaced with very, very simple tiles. So let me squeeze in some interesting info about Player 2 here. In the arcade game, Player 1 has a long-shot rifle, while Player 2 has a shorter range, wider shot. On the Genesis, both players have the same weapon. Yeah, this area is way different in both versions. Also, many enemies in this stage, like the flying heads, are smaller on Genesis. One more interesting note, the Genesis version uses the arcade Stage 4 boss on Stage 5 and vice versa. Because of that, when I unpause the Genesis version for the boss fight, I'm showing the end of Stage 5 on Genesis, so we can compare the same boss at the same time in both versions. And here it is. It looks pretty similar on both, although slightly simplified on Genesis. In the arcade, with unlimited credits, I figured, hey, why not just throw myself straight into his face and blast him until he dies to save time. On Genesis, I was more careful since you don't get continues. You have to buy resurrection potions at the shop to get extra lives. Also, from this point on, bosses take way more damage in the arcade than they do on Genesis. Alright, I'm glad we got through that boring Egyptian stage. What's next? Another Egyptian stage? So there are 2 Egyptian stages in this game? No, Capcom would never do that. Nope, there's actually 3. At least in the arcade version. Wow, so we lose the nice glowing torches and huge statues in the background on the Genesis, and it makes this stage look a lot different. Speaking of different, the layout is pretty different between these 2 versions. You get the shop almost immediately in the arcade original, and it doesn't show up until later on in the Sega version. The arcade game also has these tentacle enemies that shoot you from the floors and ceilings that are missing from the Genesis release. I'll also point out here that I personally feel this song sounds much better on Genesis. A lot of Capcom's early CPS-1 music just sounds a little bit mushy. And here we have another extremely simplified background on the Genesis. Once again, I stuck to the top path only in both versions. And oh boy, is the Genesis version getting even more different. In the arcade game, the faces stick out from the background. They block your path and you either have to go around them or destroy them. On the Genesis, they're just tiny background tiles that don't do anything. It's hard to believe that Sega didn't do something here to make this boring section a little more interactive. Even if they had just stuck in some permanently pushed out faces that you had to go around, that would have added a little to the game. So once again, I'm showing you the same boss, even though these fights occur on different levels between the 2 versions of the game. On Genesis, this is the boss of the previous level. And holy cow, does that head blow up quick on Genesis compared to the arcade game. I'll have to pause it again. Here's Phase 2. It's a giant multi-segmented worm thing that flies around the... Oh look, it's already dead on Genesis. In the arcade version, this fight takes a long time. I think Capcom made this boss such a damage sponge because they expected it to withstand 2 players blasting away at it simultaneously. This boss fight is so long that wiener dogs are like, damn, that's long. This boss fight takes so long that kids born during it will have graduated college by the end of it. This boss fight is so long that it makes the extended cut of the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy jealous.
Darn it. My business Cleopatra is spoiled.
Here's the first stage that was cut from the Genesis version. This stage is the definition of simple and superfluous. You literally just fly straight up for a height of about maybe 3 or 4 screens and then fight the boss. These weird egg-looking bubbly jellyfish type things are the only enemies in this stage. After you make your way through a long wave of them, you get to stop at the shop if you want and then head to the boss fight. And the boss is, well, this. It's a sarcophagus that you can only damage when the faceplate recedes. Hit it enough and the body breaks apart and you get to shoot at its heart or core or whatever that is. Rinse and repeat about 4 or 5 times, and hey, you just beat level 6, good for you. Can you tell I'm not sad this level was cut from the Genesis port?
Now I've got you cornered. There's no escape for you now.
Alright, onto the wild cold yonder of Stage 7 in the arcade and Stage 6 on Genesis. Oh, we're missing the frozen mammoths on Genesis at the start of the stage. And the boulders in the foreground are a lot simpler. The leaping snake or serpent type enemies are made up of much fewer segments on Genesis. The design of the mountains in the background is less complex on Genesis. as are the pagoda-style buildings and the trees in both the foreground and background. Hey, here's a handsome fella in the arcade version. I didn't know Freddy Krueger was in this game. Anyway, the ugly face enemy here is a lot smaller on Genesis. Okay, here's the boss in the arcade version. Since this fight is much longer in the arcade than on Genesis, I'm letting it start now. So this little jerk is a lot tougher and takes a lot more hits in the arcade game, as was the case with the prior few bosses. Also, it's a lot easier to get hit by his projectiles in the arcade game. Alright, here's the second stage cut from the Genesis port. I'll also point out the arcade level here has awesome music. You know what they say, you can't go wrong with FM pipe organs. What do you mean, who says that? I did. I'm a they, right? Since we need something else to look at now, here's the Sega Master System port of Forgotten Worlds. It's a surprisingly good but severely altered port of the game for Sega's little 8-bit system. It stands out as one of the better shmups available for it. It retains most of what's important and in some places adds back things missing from the Genesis version. And a few of the levels in this version combine short segments of 2 levels from the arcade game. It also has an extra and unique underwater level, which is pretty cool. In the end, though, SMS Forgotten Worlds loses way more than it adds. I mean, this version of the game only has 5 levels. So going back to the arcade game here, I'm kinda surprised this level was cut, since they could have just reused the foreground tiles from the last stage and just palette swapped the mountains and boulders. I guess space on the cartridge must have really been at a premium. In the end, this level is pretty good, and it's too bad they had to chop it out of the Genesis port. And here's our boss. Or bosses. The gods of wind and thunder. They're apparently also the gods of protein shakes, blasting their biceps and asking guys, "Do you even lift, bro?"
He's done for. I'm going to kill him. I'll burn with my aura.
Alright, back to the Genesis and the final stage of Forgotten Worlds. This level only scrolls upward, and it does so much faster in the arcade than the home version. The arcade original also sees a deluge of enemies almost constantly throughout the level, while things are a bit more leisurely on Genesis. Fans of Capcom's prior Flying Guy shooters will recognize some of the enemies in this stage. Alright, I pick up the homing laser in both versions of the game here, which shall henceforth be referred to as the bendy laser. In the arcade game, the bendy laser fires out thick, ropey beams, while on Genesis the beams are smaller and thinner. But don't worry, it's all about how you use them. These weird, Gradius-looking ball enemies with the arms and claws are much smaller on Genesis. Also, if you don't have the powerful bendy laser, they're much harder to kill in both versions of the game. These little nooks on the sides have hidden Zenny on both the top and bottom of the compartments in the arcade, but only on the top on Genesis. And hey, look at that, we're already up to the final boss in the arcade version. I'll have to pause it, I guess. You may be wondering about what that 99,900 Zenny dress does that you see in the shop on Genesis. Well, wonder no more. It gives you 1,000,000 points at the end of the game. I'll point out here that we see a little bit of slowdown and flicker on the Genesis. It's mostly relegated to this level, but there were a few instances of it in the prior levels too. Alright, the big bad. It starts out with him sending his fishy friends after you while he has a good sit. After a few rounds of that, he decides to get off his lazy butt and comes at you, bro. On the Genesis, with the bendy laser, he's an absolute pushover. In the arcade, like all the later bosses, he takes a lot of punishment before he's finally defeated. Don't worry, we're almost there. Okay, phew, finally! And now, the aristocrats. The ending. Once again, player 1 and 2 are facing opposite ways and are on opposite sides of the screen in the arcade and Genesis versions. The ending text is a little bit different in both versions too, but really, who cares? If you enjoy English, then you'll like the arcade text more. The Genesis text is cleaned up and slightly edited. Anyway, who plays a game like this for the story anyway, am I right? The scenes that we see here during the credits are a little bit different between the two versions. And that's because in the arcade game we see a few scenes from levels that were cut from the Genesis port. And here's the ending picture. In the arcade, we get a lovely sunset, while on Genesis we get a black, empty void. Now, the Genesis version of Forgotten Worlds was a good game that was an early taste of the system's power, and it really taught us that we could expect big things from Sega's 16-bit home system in the future. Now, it also taught us that we probably shouldn't expect any arcade-perfect ports on the system. And really, that pretty much held true for the lifetime of the Genesis, even though it had a lot of great arcade ports. There are a few other notable ports of Forgotten Worlds for other systems, including the PC Engine CD. I'll be taking a look at other versions of this game in the future. I'll be taking a look at another particular version of this game very soon, though, in the second ever episode of my new series called Complete Trash, in which I play a terrible game from start to finish with commentary. Can you guess which version of Forgotten Worlds I'll be playing for that episode? Alright, so that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please toss it a like and share it. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.